Since the beginning of this podcast, almost 100 episodes ago, I have been mining my 30-year Superman fandom, starting with that tattered red cape, within the larger context of the character's rich 85-year mythology, examining, discovering, and reconsidering the creative visions that have shaped the last son of Krypton. Now, our milestone 100th episode beckons, and the journey continues. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss All-Star Superman by Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely is returning guest, Mike Sangregorio. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You were here for our last episode of 2021, and you're here again at the top of 2023. It's not like we had a falling out or anything last year, but I gave you a little bit of a break because you and your wife welcomed your second child last year. So officially on the show, congratulations. We were talking off mic about what it's like having two kids. I only have the one, of course, but I know how hectic just one can be. So I figured give you a little bit of a breather while you guys acclimated to your growing family, but I'm happy to have you back now.
Thank you. Yeah, I am very excited to be back. This is always a good reason to reread something I love with this discussion in mind. So this was definitely something I was looking forward to. I couldn't believe you hadn't done All-Star because I feel like most people would say, well, it's one of, if not the best Superman story of all time. So I was very excited when you mentioned you hadn't done it with someone else.
It's come up here and there. We've talked about it a little bit in other episodes, but this is the first time I've dedicated an episode to it. Our last episode was devoted to Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, another classic story that you might have expected a full-on episode about earlier. But this, as I always say, this is a journey, and we do things a little bit differently. And it's kind of, it's about this path we've been on, and this was the right time after everything that we've read and watched and talked about. Like, this was the time to do it. Now, I got to say to the audience, I know we missed an episode last week. This was supposed to go up a week ago, but we couldn't record it. I was sick, and I lost my voice. You know, there are a lot of things that you can sort of muscle through, but when it comes to a podcast, if you can't speak, you just won't, you can't get anywhere. So I want to thank the audience. Thank you for your patience and for your well wishes. A lot of people reached out. Now, you know, Mike, we've known each other personally for years, so you know this. And I think at this point, the audience knows it killed me to miss an episode. It's a point of pride that episodes come out when they're supposed to come out. And I say we're on a weekly release schedule and episodes come out on that schedule, but it really couldn't be helped. But one thing that softened the blow, one is that I've got so many podcast series so that there's always something for people to listen to. But the other one was that I knew this was going to be a great one. Because again, when it comes to Morrison, and we've talked about this before, you and Ralph Puma, you guys are always the two I gravitate toward. You guys always come in with such insight and passion for Morrison and their stories. So I knew we were in great hands with you as co-pilot for this. And I've had, going back to this idea of a bit of a journey with All-Star Superman. I got a lot to say, a lot to share. And I just know this is going to be a great discussion. So that kind of got me through sort of my latest cold and the loss of my voice. But I got to tell you, and then I'll move past this, but I just have to say that I'm not prone to irrational worry or anything like that. I tend to stay pretty grounded and pretty rational. That's at least for the most part. And I knew I was like, I'll get my voice back. I think it was either the cold or the decongestant that I took that like totally dried me out, or something like that. Mm-hmm. But anyway, this has only happened to me like once before years ago, and not to this extent. So rationally, I was like, okay, I know I'll get my voice back. But there was that little irrational part of me that was just like, you're never going to talk again. The podcasts are over. And so I feel like I've been born again. I'm so happy to be here, to be talking about Superman. We're almost 100 episodes in. And I honestly can say that I'm as excited now, maybe even more excited than I was at the beginning, because the more we mine, the deeper we get. There's so much to talk about. The hardest part about this podcast is that there's so much I want to cover. And I like
Mm.
my big multi-episode events that we do, but you plan a few of those and most of the year is spoken for. So like there's so much stuff that's on that long-term to-do list. So I love doing this. I hated missing a week. I'm happy to be back, and I'm happy to be talking about All-Star Superman with you.
I think it's hilarious that you also waited to do whatever happened in the Man of Tomorrow, because I feel like you cannot talk about Grant Morrison without talking about Alan Moore. And despite how much the two creators tried to have nothing to do with each other, they're always linked in the public consciousness. So I'm very excited that someone listening to this could have just listened to that episode, because I just feel like it's inevitable.
Yeah, very true. And one thing that I've had in the back of my mind with these episodes, well, one of them is just the idea of a final Superman story and what sort of ending does Superman deserve? Do we deserve? What is the fitting finale for the Man of Steel? So that's one thing that I've been kicking around. But more specifically, when it comes to Moore's Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, and we talked about this in the last episode, and Morrison's All-Star Superman, when read in conjunction with DC 1 Million, which we'll talk about, both stories end with a wink. And I thought that was sort of an interesting commonality between them. So we'll get into all of that. But I don't know how much setup people really need for All-Star Superman. This is a modern classic. It was published between 2005 and 2008, 12 issues, written by Grant Morrison, drawn by Frank Quitely, and I believe inked and colored by Jamie Grant. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention on the editorial side, it was edited by Bob Schreck, but the assistant editor on this was our very own Brandon Montclair, who we've mentioned on the
One and
show
only.
before, a good friend of ours, one of the former owners of Alternate Realities, the comic book shop where we hung out for many years. And I actually reached out to Brandon, and he shared some insight with me, not even about the behind the scenes stuff like that, but just about the story itself that gave me a new perspective on this story. And I'm excited to share it. And again, to kind of talk about this little bit of a journey that I've had with All-Star Superman over the years. Just to be clear, this was never a story that I hated or disliked or anything like that. But I've been, I've read this story maybe half a dozen times, I would say, in the years since it came out. I read it as it was coming out, and then I read it in collected edition a few times after that. And while I never disliked it, it never really resonated with me to the extent that it did for you and for so many fans. And it was always kind of tough as a Superman fan, to have the story that's so revered by Superman fans and non-Superman fans alike, and to feel like a little bit left out, like it just didn't do for me what it seemed to do for so many people. And I now can better explain why and why that's changed. So, like I said, it's been an interesting process kind of working with this story over the years. And I had a little bit of an evolution even prior to talking to Brandon. And then I talked to Brandon, and then I read the story yet again. And a lot of things really kind of clicked into place. I'm going to toss it to you in 1 second. The last thing I want to say, I guess, by way of setup is I have had a number of people reach out to me, like publicly or privately, to say that they've had some mixed reactions to All-Star Superman as well. And going back to our last episode with Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, there were a number of people, we talked in the episode. My guest was Ed Gross, who's the Superman podcaster and historian, and he has a new book that's coming out. Big Superman fan. He had never read Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, but I had a bunch of people reach out to say that they too had not read it, or had only read about it, and that what they had read about it was sort of more surface level, and so they enjoyed the discussion because we really got deeper into it. So again, as I always say, people come at this stuff from different perspectives, different angles, and it's all good, it's all valid. So let me toss it to you. What has your experience, your history been with All-Star Superman, and how, if at all, have your feelings toward it changed over the years?
I bought both All Star Superman and All Star Batman and Robin when they came out back in the mid 2000s because they were event comics. Like they were a very big deal. It was a huge deal that these creators were on these books, and this was something that, as far as I could tell, everyone was reading, and you wanted to be up to date on it. Um, I read the entire thing when it was coming out. I had no idea what was going on. And I have reread it numerous times since then, but each time I get a little bit better because I feel like I can see the full picture. I'm not surprised that a lot of people haven't read it, and I think that's because the best way to describe All Star Superman is it's a Superman comic made for people who don't necessarily read Superman comics. And what I mean by that is, you and I grew up in the Shield era, right? Like we could cite some pretty deep references, and we all have our favorite long term runs. This isn't that. Right, like the second that this thing was collected, you could just hand it to people. Like I remember going to the bookstore when that was still a thing people did. This was always in print. Like you could get Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns in this thing, and you could just read it. The characters in here, for the most part, are from other medium. You know them. You recognize them. You look at this. You see Perry White. You don't need to know that he smoked cigars and he had cancer that one time, and all this other minutia that you and I know because we're Wednesday Warriors. And I think that's part of the appeal, and I think that's part of the reasons that it succeeded. But it's not an easy work. Grant Morrison's been very open about the fact that they love Superman, not just as a character to write, but as an idea. Like they always say, Superman is a response to the atom bomb. We created this terrible thing that's probably going to destroy us one day, but we also created this other thing that says, hey, you can be the best version of yourself and you can help your fellow man no matter what happens. And while that might sound a little ridiculous to say out loud, it's still a way of looking at how the story was written. And a lot of that is in here. It's basically saying you can do good things. You just have to want to do them, and have the resources available. But it's not an easy work. It's definitely not one I'll just pick up and read. And then you mentioned 1 million, and you have to thread that both before this story and after this story and kind of see the whole thing that was written many years apart. But one thing I will say over the years is that I think it's beautiful, and not just in the sense that, excuse me, not just in the sense that the art is a thing of beauty. Like Frank Quietly really took his time and drafted some very iconic visions, but also the story as a whole, particularly as it pertains to Luthor. It's a beautiful story and it's an important one. And I'm happy you mentioned that it's an ending story because I do view it that way. I view All Star Superman the way The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller is viewed for Batman people. Like this is the end. This is the end of all the great adventures. He defeats the tyrant's son. He fixes our son. He finds the best in the worst of humanity, and then he moves on and he says, well, now it's your turn. What are you guys going to do without me? So I think that's a great way of describing it. But yeah, it's not an easy work to get through. It really does require a lot of work, and it rewards that if you do it. But I'm never surprised when I meet someone and they're like, oh, I never got around to reading that. I tell them they should, but I, I also understand why they haven't.
It's so interesting to hear you say it's not an easy work because one of the things that I was going to say to you, and I will say it, is that you and I have had numerous conversations about Morrison's work, some on podcasts, and we've talked about how Morrison can be a challenging writer with these big ideas. We did an episode or a couple episodes of my comic shop book club about Morrison's new X-Men run, and the sort of the representative example that I kept going back to was Liquid Time. And I talked to you about how, in the past, something like that would have tripped me up. I would have been like, what the hell is Liquid Time? But I got past that and I was just like, all right, you just got to roll with it. And it allowed me to enjoy the work more. But I was going to say with this, I feel like this is one of Morrison's more accessible works. I do agree that repeated readings do reward you for sure. But I don't, or I guess I'll just speak more from my own experience. What challenged me here wasn't so much what the hell is Morrison talking about? What is going on here? I, Poor Ralph Puma. He came on the show, bless his heart, and explained Superman Beyond to me, and did a fantastic job. And I don't know that I could really tell you exactly what that was all about, but it was a great
Can I
episode and a
can I
great
stop you
discussion.
right there? Superman Beyond is is the best Superman story ever written.
Oh,
I will go on record as saying those two issues by Grant Morrison and Doug Monk, published um, as part of the Final Crisis crossover. I think about them every day. There are scenes in there that perfectly encapsulate everything there is to love about that character, and Ralph is the absolute best person to sell someone on that. So I'm very happy that you feel that way. But that story is for me. That is top shelf a number one Superman Beyond.
you think about it every day?
There is a scene in that comic that I have cited to creator and layman alike where Captain Atom takes Superman and he takes Ultraman, his polar opposite, and he says, selfless act meet hate crime. And then he squishes them together. And for those who don't know, this version of Captain Atom is basically Dr. Manhattan from Watchmen. So he's omnipotent, for lack of a better term. So he combines them, and when he combines them together, he creates a fictional character that has to exist in 3D space. So when you turn the page, you then have to put on 3D glasses, and the character has elevated themselves into this higher realm so that they can fight an evil version of the Monitor. And we've discussed this before, but in my mind, the Monitor is the reader, the person who's getting enjoyment out of this whole thing. So I just love the idea that you have to merge opposites together to create a version of a fictional character that can kind of fight against the reader who's enjoying watching. In that story, it's Lois being hurt, and I love this idea of merging opposites together because in Morrison's The Invisibles, which I'm a big fan of, that's the big theme is, you don't have an enemy, you have a friend you haven't met yet. And while that might seem uh, counterintuitive when that person's trying to kill you, it's really the only thing that matters. It's not a new idea. Religion in the world's got some version of that idea, but I feel like it's really well encapsulated there, where Superman can't save the day alone. He needs his polar opposite, and Superman is willing and a big enough concept to do that. The other thing I love about that book is, you were talking about endings before. That has my favorite ending, where the very last page of Superman Beyond 2 is, you see Superman's headstone, and it's supposed to be like an ill portent, like, oh, he is gonna die in this. He's not gonna survive against Darkseid. But when you see the headstone, it says to be continued, and the idea being that Superman, as the greatest fictional character, is always going to continue because he's so strong as a story. We're always going to tell some version of him, whether it's the social justice crusader of the Golden Age, or, Big Daddy of the Silver Age, or the modern version, or John Kent, or Chris Reeve, or whatever it is. He's too good a story not to tell. And I love the idea that there is no final act. There'll always be a Superman for every generation. So I think Beyond really does encapsulate that. But also, I just I just love that book. I do. I'm the only person I know who feels that way, but I love that book.
Boy, I walked right into that one. No, I appreciate you sharing that. And look, my perspective on a lot of things has changed. You came up in the last episode because my perspective on the fate of the Clark Kent of Smallville in the television crisis event changed. It changed. And I talked about how you made great arguments the first time when we did that episode a couple of years ago about how I hated it, and you brought up some great points. It took me a long time, but I've really come around on it. So Superman Beyond may very well be one of those things where we do an episode down the line and I'm like, hey, I totally get it now. But right now, at least, I do still look at that as a bit more inscrutable, where I look at All Star Superman and I wouldn't put it in the same category, but I think they're, again, certainly spending the time with it and reading it a few times and really understanding what Morrison was setting out to do. Again, my perspective has shifted a lot. I think that, and again, I don't know that people need much by way of plot setup for this, but essentially it tells the story of Superman's final days. He is dying of solar radiation poisoning as a result of a situation orchestrated by Lex Luthor. And over the course of the 12 issues, he performs his 12 legendary labors. And, we'll talk about them. But what you end up getting is, in each issue, really, a beautiful, and you used the word beautiful before, and I would co-sign on that in terms of the art. And I want to talk about Quitely and the acting that Quitely does through the art. It's next level. But it's a beautiful story. I teared up a number of times, and what you really get is this beautiful encapsulation, not of a specific era, but really of the entire Superman mythology in each of these issues. You read that Jimmy Olsen issue, and I think you get a story that captures the, it wasn't 80 years at the time, but right, the decades long mythology with that supporting character. And you get that with Lois, and you get that with Candor, and you get that with Bizarro, and you get it with Luther. And it's I think the reason why this is a story that is on every best of list, is an evergreen book that you're always going to find at any good comic shop, and you're always going to find it at Barnes and Noble, and it's always going to be there. Now, I don't know that this is the first Superman story I would recommend to someone. Although, to your point, I know you said it's a story made for people who like typically aren't Superman fans, and I'm not saying it's a bad first story, but and look, I worked at a comic shop. I know that at some point along the way, someone came in and said, "Oh, I want to get into Superman." I'm sure that was either at the top of the pile, even though I wasn't the biggest fan, back then, but it still was something that I would recommend. But I would still probably, it would depend on what the person was interested in, what their tastes were, things like that. But kind of taking everything else out of the equation, I would still probably start someone off with a Birthright or a For All Seasons before I would throw this at them necessarily. But again, I don't think it's a bad first Superman story, but it probably would not be the first one that I would recommend right off the bat to someone.
The reason I said it was difficult, it's difficult for me, is is because I don't find the version of Superman that exists in these 12 issues to be compelling as a protagonist. So I agree with you that each issue focuses on an aspect of the larger mythology, and it does it incredibly well. That Jimmy Olsen issue is perfect, really truly perfect. Um, but this Superman is one who's at the height of his power, of his game, of his prestige. Um, and all of his conflict doesn't really come from the fact that he's dying, because that actually makes him more powerful and more focused on what he wants to accomplish before the end arrives. Um, it's about how he doubles down on the Clark identity to make sure that he remains incredibly relatable. But in this, it's almost caricaturish, because in every time he's not wearing the glasses and the rumpled suit and all the wonderful acting, to borrow your term, that Quietly puts into it, he's perfect. He's Superman at his absolute apex. He can do everything that we want him to do. And I always go back to the speech that the character of Bill in Kill Bill Volume 2 gives, which is, when Superman is acting as Clark Kent, is this what he thinks of us? Is this what he is pretending to be? He's acting the fool, because that's how he sees us. That's not how I envision the character. I envision, and you and I have discussed this before, but I think of Clark on the farm in Smallville, where it's like, no, he is a little bit of a klutz. I don't care if he can fly to the moon under his own power. And the Clark Kent who works at the Daily Planet is just a little bit more played up for that version. But I don't think of him as this, aloof god or like Doctor Manhattan. So that I always found very difficult to get around, because I was basically like, why are you doing this? Like, why are you wearing this suit and saving the dog and doing everything else? Well, you should save the dog. We know that from Man of Steel. You should definitely save the dog. But all the acting and the pretending, and it's just like, if this is how you think of us, why are you doing this? But again, that's a minor quibble when you look at everything that's being done here, and we haven't even gotten to the plot. I mean, Kryptonian astronauts, the Bizarro world from the Underverse, everything else that goes on here, the micro Superman army of Kandor. I mean, these 12 issues are, from beginning to end, pure beautiful imagination, and that's really, I think, the greatest tribute to the character that you could give.
Totally. So that's a perfect segue. This is the journey that I've had with this story. So when I read it in the mid aughts when it first came out, like I said, it didn't totally click with me. What I'm sure I said at the time was it wasn't quote unquote my Superman. It wasn't the post crisis triangle era Superman I had grown up with. And again, it wasn't that I had an intense dislike for it, but it just didn't really speak to me. A lot more recently, for this podcast, when Rich Roney and I, our mutual friend, when we covered a selection of Silver Age Superman stories, almost all of which were new to me, I pulled out All Star Superman and I gave that a reread. And things made more sense because now I had a background in Silver Age Superman, which introduced the Fortress and Candor and a lot of these elements, the mad scientist Lex that was developed further during that time, that Morrison uses here. And at that point, my understanding of All Star Superman expanded, but was still incomplete because at that point, and I haven't gone back to that episode, but what I probably say in that episode is, well, Morrison was writing the Silver Age Superman, or some version of that is probably what I said. And I think that Morrison is certainly pulling from a lot of those Silver Age ideas. And man, what a perfect combo. Right? We always talk about Morrison and these big ideas, liquid time, a bibliobot that can recite Moby Dick at such high frequencies that it operates as a drill. And that's how Lex is able to burrow this tunnel under his prison cell in All Star. Like that, I feel like it's this perfect blend. So it's such a natural fit, these crazy Silver Age big ideas and the Morrison vibe. But it is more than that. Like we talked about, really is such an encapsulation of the entire mythology. I look at the way Quitely draws the character, and in particular Clark, and I see Tim Sale's Clark from For All Seasons. That sort of that big lumbering presence, right? And in All Star, Clark in the Smallville time travel episode even talks about how there's not enough space in the city. So it's like, yes, there's an act that he's putting on, but also this idea that he's a big guy and he's used to these wide open spaces. So maybe when he knocks over that cup of pencils, it's not totally for show, which I appreciated. We get a version of Doomsday in this, right? Which was a very modern pull. So again, it's not just a Silver Age story. So my understanding continued to expand. Now, and bear with me here, I don't mean to monologue, but I've been sorting this out for a while and I got to get this out. So I've said this on a number of episodes and I don't want to belabor the point. So I'll get through it quickly. My thesis of, sort of different presentations of the character and what I see when I look at Silver Age Superman, when I look at the Donner movies, I see a god living among men who is a bit more removed from humanity. One of the first Silver Age stories I read was the introduction of the Fortress of Solitude. And in either that story or one of the early Silver Age issues, Superman has kind of a quiet night to himself. So he goes to the fortress to perform experiments. And I just remember thinking to myself, the Superman I grew up with wouldn't do that. Like, it just felt like there was this degree removed. Whereas I look at the Triangle era Superman, the Superman of Lois and Clark, the New Adventures of Superman, the Superman of Smallville, the Superman of the Snyder movies. And I see a man with the powers of a god, right? Not a god living among men. And that distinction is one that has allowed me to kind of enjoy all of those stories in their own way, because I kind of can account for what I perceive to be some of the differences. Now, what do I make of All-Star Superman? And this is where Brandon Montclair comes in, because I looked at All-Star even up until my very last reading of it. So my second to last reading, just a couple of weeks ago, I was looking at this and I had a similar reaction as you. Still, this idea that he's, Superman is apex, he's got everything together. I was like, okay, this is sort of the, God living among men. And it's still a little bit hard for me to connect. What Brandon shared was, he said and I'm paraphrasing here, not a direct quote, but he brought up the idea of how this story is so rooted in Midwestern values, not in a political sense, but just sort of in those values in terms of, the strength of the individual, but also helping a neighbor, sort of the way Brandon framed it that really made everything click into place was, this was not a Clark or a Superman like crippled by neurosis or, wrestling with some of the things that we see in some of these other modern stories. This is a Superman very clear of purpose, right? He's going to help anyone in need. He's going to help that neighbor, whether it's that suicidal girl on the roof of the building or a manned mission to the sun that's been sabotaged, right? It's all the same to him, right? It's helping the neighbor. And so when he's dealing with his impending mortality, there are flashes where you do see it weighing on him, but it's not something that he's wallowing in. We don't see it. we don't see the struggle articulated maybe to the extent that we would have or that we do in these other more modern stories. And so after Brandon said that, this idea that the brilliance of the story is how it's rooted in these Midwestern values, and um, he didn't use the word stoic, but maybe that does kind of apply here to an extent. I read it again, not looking at a god, but just looking at someone from the Midwest and how they would sort of go about the journey that this character does in the story, and I saw more of the man and less the god, and a lot more of it made sense for me. So I thank Brandon for what he shared, but it also, and I'm going to get your take on this, but the last thing I want to say is it really made me think about how my view of the character has so been shaped by what I grew up with. And it's like, of course, I'm not breaking any news here, but I thought more specifically about what that means. And even going back to watching Lois and Clark as a little kid, this romantic comedy essentially, right? As they're trying to navigate this workplace romance, to 10 years of Smallville, where a show filled with angst and guilt and self-doubt, to the Snyder movies where he spends two full movies not, and I love that. And that's the thing, I love all of this. But he spends the movie not knowing what his role in the world is going to be. And you see so much more, I think, of that internal struggle manifested. And I recognize that that has shaped to me what I guess kind of expect out of the character, and what does resonate with me. I like that iteration of the character. So when you give me something like All Star, a Superman so clear of purpose that even his impending doom really doesn't slow him down all that much, it takes me a minute. It really does. And so again, and it's not a positive or negative. It was just kind of a little bit eye opening and just made me kind of realize how I've been so shaped by what I grew up with. So I toss it to you, man. What is your reaction to this?
I have never spoken to Brandon about All Star Superman, but every time I talk to Brandon, it is a hoot. The way I always enjoyed the story and I always appreciated it, but the way I connected with it most strongly was by watching the adaptation. So All Star Superman was made into direct to streaming or DVD, whatever it was at the time, movie, and it was adapted by comic scribe Dwayne McDuffie, who never wrote a bad comic and worked on the DCAU quite extensively before he unfortunately passed away. Um, I think his adaptation actually improves on the story in a couple of ways. Most notably, and spoilers for those of you who haven't watched the thing, um, it ends with Lex having a redemption moment. So the comic ends with Lex realizing why Superman is the way he is, and kind of acknowledging that and kind of putting into perspective a lot of what Superman was doing as Clark throughout the course of the comic. He keeps trying to tell Lois Clark Kent and Superman are the same person. Lois doesn't believe him. Hilarity ensues. But he doesn't do that with Lex. And in fact, most of the scenes with Lex are with Clark. And Lex, the smartest man who has ever lived, who ever will live, can't even consider the possibility that they are the same person. He, in fact, constantly compliments Clark for his humanity and his mundanity and all of these other things. And it's beautiful because it's like a myth. It's like the god has come down and they're trying to teach the human a lesson. And in the comic, they learn the lesson, but in the movie, they turn it back on the hero. And what I mean by that is McDuffie added a scene in the movie where Lex, after he has lost his abilities and come back down to Earth and Superman has left, he is the one who gives the world the next version of Superman. He actually writes out the Superman genetic code, whatever the MacGuffin is, in a book, in a Superman beautiful bound book that he hands to Dr. Quintum. And he says, "This is it. This is my gift to the world. I saw what he saw. I finally understand why he does what he does, why he and I are so different. I stood in his shoes, and as a result, I want to share that with everyone." And when I saw that, I realized what should have been obvious to me because he's always been one of my favorite characters. All Star Superman is in many ways Lex Luthor's story. It opens with Lex committing the worst crime ever, not killing Superman, but deciding that the science he claims to worship isn't worth it, and he sabotages man's first trip to the sun. He's Dr. Alexander Luthor. He should have been on that ship. He should have been doing all of these things. And you watch a man who, constantly talks about how great he is, but isn't accomplishing anything other than the most petty acts, go and ultimately save the world. And he did it because he watched Superman do it first. And that really connected with me, because I thought, what greater act could Superman have on Earth than taking his most ardent, this guy who says, "You're bad, you're making us worse," and showing him, "No, I'm trying to teach everyone to be better to each other and be the best you can be. And if it works on Lex Luthor, then everyone's going to get the message." And if you read 1 million, you see that everything works out. 1,000 years from now, we have the Legion of Superheroes. And however many years before we get to DC 1 million, we've colonized the solar system and we've moved on, and there's still a Superman, and all this great stuff has happened. And most people credit it to the idea that, you will believe a man can fly.
Right on. I'm glad you brought up the animated adaptation. I did also rewatch that, and uh, I didn't dislike it. It was interesting to me for the most part. You called out what is probably the most substantive uh, difference, or specifically addition to the film. Most of what is presented is straight from the pages of the comic. The biggest alterations are the omissions, and that broke my heart a little bit. I know they had limited real estate, and look, we've had this conversation, and we'll continue to have it about, especially those earlier entries in these DC animated movies where New Frontier or Superman Doomsday, they had to excise such large segments of the story to make them fit in the runtime. I can appreciate that, but losing the Smallville sequence broke my heart. Losing the Jimmy episode broke my heart. So there were some omissions there that were really kind of tough for me to get past. I gotta say though, love Christina Hendricks as Lois. Love that. The voice cast overall, I was a big fan of, but love her as Lois. So I was happy to have that performance. I remain mixed about the change to Lex. Your argument is well taken, and I don't. It's not like I disagree. I don't really know where I land, because there's something about that comic ending where Lex has this epiphany, right, as he is experiencing Superman's powers, and finally has a sense of what it is Superman perceives, how we're all connected, right? And the powers fade, and Superman destroys the remaining serum that Lex has, and Lex instantly lashes out, right? He's like, "Well, now I could have saved everyone," and it's that punch to the face. And if you had cared about saving the world, you would have done it years ago. And to me, I kind of look at this iteration of Lex at least, and I kind of say that to me feels like a fitting end. But I can also see the value in him actually having that redemptive moment after. Also, I know that this might be tough to reconcile, because in the last episode we talked about whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow and Smallville in particular. I won't rehash the whole thing, but basically, one of the things that allowed me to make peace with the Tom Welling scene in Crisis is there's nothing to give us the indication of this in the scene. However, talk about headcanon, I'm fascinated by the idea, a version of a story where the Clark and Lex of Smallville reconcile, repair the friendship that was seemingly broken forever. So I'm on board with the idea of redemption for Lex. In this instance, though, I don't know, that punch to the face really just felt like the note to go out on. But I remain conflicted on that. But what I wanted to ask you when it comes to Lex in particular, the big Lex issue, number 5, right, where Clark is interviewing him at prison. At the end of the story, as Lex is, leading Clark away through that subterranean passageway, Lex says there's no deep psychology behind my hatred for Superman. How would you feel if someone deliberately stood in your way over and over? We've talked a lot about Lex on the show. I did a whole multi-part event on Lex and the evolution over the years and everything. And, grew up with this Smallville iteration where there's this friendship that goes awry between these two guys. What is your reaction to that line? This idea that there's no deep psychology, it's really this simple. Does that ring true? Does that not not jive with sort of your conception of Lex and this dynamic? Like, what do you make of that?
Well, I think the character believes that. I don't think it's true, but I think the character believes that, and I think that it pretty much explains everything about the character because you know regardless of what origin you use or what setup, it's always the same that Lex hates Superman. Lex doesn't just want to conquer the world and Superman keeps getting in his way. Lex hates him. Like that is the defining characteristic of their relationship. Like Lex hates this man and he gives a bunch of different reasons, right? I remember on one episode Ralph talked about like the cuckoo theory. Like, sometimes super Lex believes that Superman is the beginning of an alien invasion, right? This immortal, super powerful person who only looks like us but isn't us is going to populate this world and fill it with this dead race and all of this other terrible stuff. And all of that motivation is deep psychology. But to Lex, it's simple because Lex comes from the perspective of you have unlimited power. Why are you not doing what I would do with unlimited power? I have conquered every aspect of this world that I have set out to do. I was president. I conquered capitalism. I invented any, super scientific thing that needed to be from the plot. I've done all of that, but you show up and you can do anything that you can think of, and all you want to do is help people. And Lex can't see things from that point of view, which is why he's such a good foil. So when he says there's no deep psychology, I think the character believes that. And I think it's why the smartest man who's ever lived keeps ending up in prison. Because, well, no, Lex, there is really deep psychology about this. And Clark understands that. And he's trying to get you to see that. And that's why I like in the movie, because I like knowing that if nothing else, Lex isn't going to be a problem anymore. Lex actually realized, like, oh man, I was wrong. And because he's Lex, because he's not just someone on death row, he does something about it. He says, okay, Superman's gone. Here you go. Now you have his power. What are you guys going to do with it? Did everyone watch and learn what I learned? Do you know how to help each other? Do you know how to take this information, this literal fire from Olympus, and be good with it? Or are you all going to turn out like me? And I just think that's so perfect. And we know that when Quintum gets it, he's going to try to create another Superman, and someone who isn't a Bizarro, and someone who's going to begin the Superman lineage that we see in All Star Superman reflected in Cal Kent and the other characters. And I love that in one version of the story that begins with Lex, because it's like, yeah, why not? His redemption is something that Superman accomplished, maybe the greatest of his labors, really, if you think about it.
Well said, well said. And I have to say too, with Lex, a couple of things that I really loved about this. One is, we've seen numerous Lex Luthor real estate schemes. I love that at the top of this story, he sabotaged this mission to the sun, but he's also invested in. He's got this water scheme, right? Like where he's building dams.
Yeah,
He's going to control the water supply because now it's going to be in
yeah.
short supply, and for. So I just thought it's like that was such a nice nod to these real estate schemes that we've seen before, and then the fact that ultimately Superman is able to save our son because of what Lex did to him in manipulating him into this situation where he has to intervene with this manned mission to the sun, and his cells are oversaturated with solar radiation and they start dying. Right, but if not for that, he would not be able to save the sun in the end. So really, Lex is basically the hero of the story, I guess, is what it comes down to.
Yeah, in many
No, I'm just
ways,
kidding.
he's the I mean, in many ways, he is the protagonist. I mean, you want to think that a story called All Star Superman is the protagonist is going to be Superman, but he's really not. He's reacting to a lot of things when the Kryptonian astronauts show up, when the Bizarros show up, uh, when the Doomsday issue happens. Like he's reacting to these things, and for the most part, he's there. In the beginning of where he is at the end. I'm not saying the character doesn't change at all, but when Dr. Quintum says you're gonna die, he's like, oh yeah, I kind of figured that was the case. And then at the end, when he goes into the sun, it's like, those around him have changed. Lois has come to accept the truth, and Lex has come around. But in many ways, the other characters are the protagonists in the story, and I think that's one of the reasons that this thing works so well because like the reader, you're seeing people affected by what Superman does. Superman is Superman. He will continue to be Superman. He's going to come out of the sun. He's going to continue to be Superman. And in his wake, there were 100,000 other Supermen, and they all did the best they possibly could. Even Zabaro, right? Like this, all Star Superman is filled with versions of Superman that aren't Superman, whether it's Atlas and Solomon, the Kryptonian astronauts, Bizarro, a hundred other examples I could list. And the whole point is that Morrison is showing you like one aspect of what made this character popular isn't enough. You need all of them and you need all of them working together. You need to see someone mourning their father just as strongly as they want their wife's birthday to be perfect, just as much as they want their enemy not to die in vain because of anger. That's something so petty, but also a man who takes pride in his work. Like Clark is all of these things. He's a multitude of things. And when you put them together, you get the greatest idea we've ever had and you get the greatest hero in the world. But no, I would say that Lex and Lois and the other ones, they're the protagonists. They're the ones who want things and who change over the course of the story while Superman is affecting the world around them.
Interesting. It's funny when we talk about his reaction to finding out about his death. What stood out to me, is when Leo Quintum is sort of beating around the bush a little bit, and Superman just says, "Tell me straight." That I think is an example of the Midwestern values. There, it's like let's just do this. But he takes a beat, and the first thing he says is, "Don't tell anyone. There are things I have to do first." And I love that the first thing he does is tell Lois that he's Superman. And I mean, I agree certainly to a point. I think in most of these issues, he is, he's not driving the action. He's reacting right to things that are happening, with a number of exceptions. In particular, when he lets Lois in on the secret and takes her to the fortress, and then later, especially when we get into all of the Candor business, as well. But throughout the story, and it's, I guess this is fitting because we just passed the holidays, and I have my annual tradition of watching "It's a Wonderful Life." And what?
That's such a you thing to do. Like that is absolutely. If I had to guess, if someone asked me, like, "What do you think Anthony Desiato is doing for the holidays?" I would guess. I would say at some point he's probably watching A Wonderful Life. Like that is just that's a you thing to do, and I love that that is something you actually do.
Absolutely. And look, and I've talked about this on the show before, I'm sure, but I know I did. That whole movie, you have a character who longs to do great things, and along the way, what he's actually doing is a series of good things, good deeds for his neighbors. And in the end, in his hour of need, those people rally around him, right? And he realizes what he had all along. And in kind of a similar way, I see that with this version of the character. It's a character again driven by this neighborly desire, right, to be kind and to help in all of these situations throughout the story. And maybe one of the reasons I hated that the animated movie lost the Smallville sequence, when we get to Clark's eulogy for Jonathan. And again, going back to this idea of seeing more of the man and less the god in this story, you read Clark's eulogy about how Jonathan Kent taught me that the strong have to stand up for the weak, that the bullies don't like being bullied back, and that the measure of a man lies not in what he says, but what he does. Like we say at the end of every episode, it's about what you do, it's about action. It's like that informs. I think once you have that, even before you have that, but once you have that, like everything that this character does totally tracks, and you see, you see where it comes from, and you see that kindness, and like you said, what it inspires in other people. So it's a beautiful thing, and that's where I think again for me in particular, where so much of that humanity comes from in this iteration, this all-star version of the character, while you're getting these greatest hits of all of these really iconic aspects of the Superman mythology. It is still ultimately grounded in that. We still have a lot to unpack, but I want to talk about the ending and how it ties in with 1 million. So, I suspect most people are familiar with 1 million, but in case you're not, this was, I believe it was 98, right? Was a what? Wait,
Yeah,
let me
that
see.
sounds about right.
Yeah.
I'm
So
just wondering if you have a single sentence synopsis of 1 million, which is one of the most complicated crossovers I've ever read. So I cannot wait to hear this.
again, we're actually going to be doing a 1 million episode a little bit later,
Oh,
in a
okay.
couple of months, so not too long from now. So we're going to spend some more time on 1 million. So I don't, I won't. This won't be exhaustive, but a 4-issue miniseries, but it tied into every DC title published in that month. This was again in the vein of your Zero Hour, your Final Night, your Genesis, those DC events of the '90s, and spearheaded by Morrison, who wrote the core 4-issue miniseries. And it was this idea that we have a version of the Justice League from the 853rd century, led by a descendant of Superman, who comes to our time to invite the Justice League to their era to witness the return of the original Superman, Superman Prime, who is emerging at long last from the sun. Not bad, right? For a succinct summary of this. Uh,
You left out why it's called DC 1 million, though. Do you know that?
oh yeah, well it's what like 1 million, in the publishing history, right? If it had been like
Yeah,
1 million months.
the arbitrary, the seemingly arbitrary setting of I don't know what it is, but I think it's like the 853rd comma number century, like somewhere so far in the future that it doesn't have any bearing. Is I think when the first DC comic would have reached or will reach issue 1 million. So that's why it's named that, and that's why it's set so absurdly far in the future. I just love that because it's never even mentioned in the comic. The comic only ever refers to it as like the Justice Legion A event. I think it's funny.
So let's just the disclaimer. We recognize that these Morrison is not literally in a strict continuity sense writing the same Superman in 1 million and All-Star, right? 1 million was set firmly in the post-crisis era. That's the version of Superman who was married to Lois. That's who they were writing then. However, I think it's more than fair to say that in a spiritual sense, Morrison was writing the same character, just as Morrison was writing the same character in the New 52, right? I think in much the same way that Morrison approached Batman, like the entirety of the Batman mythology exists and the times change, but we can sort of look at it as this vast tapestry. I think it's fair to say that's what Morrison was intending here as well. So at least in a spiritual sense, I think we can see those connection points. So
It's a literal sense too if you work in hyper time, but we don't need to discuss that here.
yeah, that might be pushing things a little bit. Might
Yeah.
get into Superman Beyond territory. Um, but and in All Star, you do see a number of direct ties, right? So the Smallville issue in particular, we have this whole time travel aspect. The Superman, what do they call themselves? A Superman, not emergency squad or rescue squad. What do they call themselves? The
Oh, I just
Superman.
call them the Super Squad. Is that not what they're
Yeah,
called?
maybe that is just it. Maybe the
Okay.
Superman squad, right? And our present day Superman meets the golden Superman Prime, and there's this moment where he says, which of my descendants are you? And Superman Prime is just like, ha. And of course, Superman, fights Solaris, the tyrant son. So there, we have a lot of ties here to the point where it's reasonable to look at the end of All Star, where Superman is being converted into this solar energy being and flies into the heart of the sun to repair the sun after the damage caused by Solaris, and kind of draw a line from that to the Superman Prime who emerges in that 1 million story so far into the future. Now, of course, this doesn't totally line up in 1 million, in particular in one of the Superman issues. And I think it might have been Man of Tomorrow, but they actually filled in the gaps, and the sort of the backstory in that 1 million event was that after everyone around him had died, he outlived everyone. Superman journeyed the stars for like hundreds of years, and then came back. He had spawned his descendants already, and they continued to protect the galaxy while he was gone. But then when he returned, he took up residence and built a new fortress in the sun. So it wasn't that he went straight to the sun. So there are some differences, but ultimately at the end of 1 million, Superman Prime emerges, and through some fifth dimensional wizardry, and a DNA sample of Lois Lane, they are able to recreate Lois for Superman Prime and also bring back a new Krypton as well. And our JLA is there to witness it, and we have Kyle Rayner who's recounting all of this, and this is where the bit about the wink comes into play, because he shares that the golden Superman Prime turned and winked. So this idea of like what an appropriate ending for Superman is, I think there are only so many ways you can go with this. Smallville and Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow give us this idea of him relinquishing his powers and living as a man and having a family, right? And then presumably dying as everyone does. Or we have something along the lines of what we get here, where Superman basically lives forever. And then there's also another instance that comes to mind in the Action Comics 1000 issue. Tom King wrote a story where Superman was visiting Earth as it was dying, and he was saying a final farewell to Jonathan and Martha, who of course were long gone. And there's a reference to Lois, taking a serum that enables her to keep living. So in all these instances, I suppose the Lois seems to be the constant, right? Either he's living as a man with Lois, or he remains this super being indefinitely, and is either reunited or remains with Lois. And I'm sure there are other Elseworlds and other variations, but these certainly seem to be kind of heavy hitters when we're talking about like what becomes of this character. Let me ask you first, which iteration, which version do you gravitate more toward as a general ending for this character?
I think that all the best Superman stories are love stories. I think that Clark Kent was raised by two parents who loved themselves, excuse me, each other and him, as much as a family can love each other. And I think that is his strongest imprint of what he's learned on the world. So I think he values that very much. And you know, he meets Lois and he falls in love with Lois, and that's it. That is the beginning and the end of the story, and that happens in Action Comics #1. So I don't think that there's any Act 3 for the Man of Tomorrow that doesn't include him spending whatever it is that his life is with Lois. I think there always has to be some reason that they get to live together, with kids, without kids, as immortals, as conceptual beings. At the end of Crisis on Infinite Earths, the two of them, the original ones, the Golden Age characters, they're given just a generic heaven, with the idea being that these characters can't die. They're too important. They're the foundation stones of everything else. And Marv Wolfman and George Perez very nicely say, you know what? You guys get to go to heaven and you get to enjoy yourselves. And well, Jeff Johns wrecked that, but we're not going to talk about that tonight. But that's my headcanon is if Superman is alive, Lois has to be alive, because otherwise I just don't think that that's something he would want. I wouldn't want to put that on him. Another great example of what I'm talking about is the stories of Kingdom Come and Injustice, which are
Yes.
predicated on the idea that Lois is not just unfortunately murdered, but murdered violently as retribution against him, and he loses it. He becomes unmoored. Injustice a little bit more aggressively. I prefer Kingdom Come, but there's nothing left. He doesn't he's rudderless. He doesn't have a connection to the world around him anymore. And I felt that. I've been married a very long time, and I completely understood that. I understood that even before I was married. Like, this is what this guy really wants. Like, he can do anything you can think to have him do, but what he wants is to go home to the brunette who yells at him, right? What everyone wants. So I think that has to be very important, and I think any story that doesn't have Lois in it is just gonna, you know, he'll find a way to go back to her. Whether it's giving up his powers so that they can have kids in a couple decades together, or doing some fifth dimensional shenanigans so that they can live together in the far future, or something else. I think the story of Superman is a story of uh, Clark and Lois.
So I don't disagree with any of that. So it seems like for you, as long as Lois is there, it feels like a right ending. I guess what I'm really wrestling with is this idea of living forever. And Before I give my take, let me ask you this. How do I put this? You certainly can read All Star totally in a vacuum on its own, not in conjunction with 1 million. And in fact, given how popular All Star is and how well it's sold and in bookstores and everything, I'm sure there are a ton of people, right, who really have no conception of 1 million. Maybe they're and honestly, even if you just read it on its own, we know at the end of All Star, Superman gives Leo Quintum, his DNA, his genetic code, along with Lois's, right? And we end on this, the Superman symbol looking like a 2, right? So this idea, more Superman will come. So, when you get to the Descendants and the other issues, it all kind of tracks, and there's this internal logic and everything. So you definitely can read it on its own, I guess. And even going back to what we said at the beginning, this idea of a final Superman story, I think that's definitely the intention, and I think that's the more than makes sense to read it that way. But Lois says at the end of the story, like, he's repairing the sun, and when he's done, he'll come back. I mean, you could read this that he comes back in the relatively near future. Again, I do not think that is the intention, but I suppose you potentially could. It's open ended enough. Certainly, when you pair it with 1 million, that changes things a little bit. Do you have any sort of feeling, like, how do I put this? Are you interested in a version of the story divorced from 1 million, where you're just kind of reading this on its own, and it really is more open ended, and you don't know if he ever comes back, and if he does, when, and you can sort of build your own ending? Or do you like reading it, and do you feel it's more effective, really, in that context of 1 million, where we kind of know, at least in a general spiritual sense, what the ultimate outcome is?
I advocate divorcing it from 1 million. I don't like the idea that if Superman goes into the sun in issue 12 of All Star, he's not seen for another million years or whatever arbitrary number it is, because that means that Lois spends the rest of her life alone. And I hate that. So I don't care if, he takes a coffee break and comes back for 50 years, or once he's Golden God Superman in the year 853,000, he time travels back. They Morrison constantly makes a point of saying that by that point, Superman will have fifth dimensional powers. And that's a term Morrison throws around a great deal. But what it basically means is you can time travel at will, and you don't have to worry about paradoxes or anything. That's really what it means for story purposes. So, if Superman shows up as, what's his name in the Alan Moore story, Jordan Elliott, right? And he shows up and he marries Lois, and they pull a Captain America and Endgame, and they have a very happy life. I do think that's important because, like I said, I don't I don't think the connection to 1 million strengthens both stories to the degree that it's worth imagining Lois alone for the rest of her life. I think that's miserable, and I don't think that that's what was intended. I do like that the stories connect, but to your point, it's like you can always go back into the sun. Like, I don't know how long it's going to take to make an artificial heart, whatever that even means. But you can come back and forth. You can do whatever the story entails. The idea that he's just up there for 800,000 years was always a little weird to me. I kind of assumed that was artistic license, but no. To your point, I'd rather know that he's going to come back and he's going to be with her, and eventually he'll go back there, and eventually she'll know, like, okay, I'm going to join you one day, but we have to let this thing play out, and we have to let the world get on with its business.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess would align myself with that as well. I guess what I'm ultimately getting at here is any version of the story where he lives forever, or as close to forever as we see in these stories, whether it is Kingdom Come, and then, and again, that's a story where he finds love anew with Wonder Woman after the tragic loss of Lois. But you see him alive there in the time of the Legion of Superheroes, right? You see his younger self flying around. But whether it's that
That's
or,
Connor.
oh, what?
That's Connor, by the way.
Well, who's flying
That's
around at the
Connor.
end of it?
Yeah, sorry. That's
Oh,
Alex Ross said that in an interview. That's Connor Kent.
oh, right on. Okay. So whether it's that or the Tom King version where Earth is dying and Lois is taking the serum, or the 1 million version where Superman's been gone for just untold centuries, and then has a very lovely reunion with Lois. I wouldn't, and this, bear with me here. I would not wish life everlasting on Superman. I There's something inherently tragic to me about that. Did you watch The Good Place on NBC by any chance? The Kristen Bell, Ted Danson sitcom.
I I tried. I did. You very heartily recommended Veronica Mars to me, and I got through the first season, and I had to give it up. And I did the same thing with The Good Place. I tried. I got through the first season, and then I had to stop.
Oh, all right. Maybe not a Kristen Bell fan. It's all right. But
Huge Kristen Bell fan. That's hence
oh,
the second attempt. But I no, I couldn't do it.
oh, I'm sorry to hear that. I don't want to spoil anything about The Good Place. It ran for 4 seasons, and if anyone hasn't watched it, again, I know it wasn't your cup of tea, but I loved it, and I don't want to spoil much about it or anything about it, but it does deal with the afterlife, and at a certain point in the show, it does explore this idea of what it would truly mean to be in the afterlife, even the good place, aka heaven, for an eternity, and kind of the toll that would eventually take, and the importance of knowing that there is an end. Again, not to get too philosophical or spiritual, but I think what makes any journey, right, so meaningful is that it doesn't last forever. And so when I look at these stories where Superman's just just still going, there's just something inherently sad to me about that. And so I think that's why, and I said last time that the whatever happened ending is my preferred a version of a finale for the character, because I guess I don't see it as this great gift to be alive in the 31st century or the 850th or whatever it might be. So I keep coming back to that. Now at the same time, when we're talking Morrison and All Star, and look, Morrison and JLA, for example, really played up these characters as living myths, right? And so I think you see that theme in All Star as well. This idea of Superman really as this living, breathing myth. And so I think this idea that he goes into the sun and that maybe he is even there for that many centuries, it's fitting, I think, for the Morrison version and for the story we get here. So I'm not even saying that I dislike this as an ending. And I also look, we don't need to have this. We haven't gotten a ton of final Superman stories as we talked about last time, and when we do, I think it is appropriate and fitting to approach them in different ways. So I'm not even saying, oh, I wish this ended differently, but I think it's a fitting ending for this story. But I just, when I think about, generally speaking, what I would want for my favorite character, it's not that. It's just
One of
not.
my I you make an excellent point. One of my favorite last days of Superman bits is from Red Sun, where the last time you see him, he's been on Earth so long that the sun has become red, like Rao was for Krypton, and he doesn't have his powers anymore, and he's finally starting to age. So even though he's been on the Earth for I don't know, a million years or however many, he actually does have an end in sight, and he's not dumb. He must have known that that was going to happen once the sun changed, and he's comfortable with that. And he's narrating to, I don't remember who he's talking to, but he's narrating down his thoughts, and he's like, well, I was sweating today. I noticed wrinkles, I noticed whatever else, but it's clearly something he's accepted because obviously, anytime during that, he could have left or he could have made amends. Um, so I agree with you. I think that regardless of what his conception is, he's really human, at least mentally, at least psychologically. So I agree. I really don't see the character as wanting to live forever, certainly not alone. And I kind of like the idea that presented with the opportunity, he might say, oh, okay, it's time to have my twilight years. But I will say something too, something that is important for All Star Superman is Superman is constantly presented as having a perception on things that is non-human. And by that I mean, you know, Clark isn't human. Like even in the Good Place, they talk about um, there's mortal and there's immortal. right? Ted Danton's character is immortal, or he's a conceptual being. Humans are built and designed from the perspective of mortality. We're meat machines. We age, we run out of fuel, all the other stuff. Superman isn't. Superman is powered by the very energy that powers everything else. So his perception is different as well. So you have to remember that while we may look at things and say, oh, okay, we're going to reach an end at one point, we expected that, he doesn't necessarily have that perspective. Even when he's talking to Lois, he says, not only has my strength increased, my curiosity and my compassion and everything else has increased a millionfold. And I like the idea that, and you said this before, but him bursting into solar radiation, it's him dying from a human perspective, but from a Kryptonian perspective, it's really just evolving. Morrison said in an interview that in issue number one, when Superman creates a field of invulnerability around the craft and pulls it to Earth, that was a reference to the Electric Superman of the late 90s, a version of the character that Superman Morrison had written. And it's this idea that the idea of Superman becoming a being of pure energy isn't something that they invented for All Star Superman. It's there. If you are powered by solar radiation, you're something else is going on with you. You don't just look and act like us. You're a different type of creature. So I think that's important too, because it affects the perception. But like I said, I also think that if they if Clark knows that there is the possibility his story might end, he might take it.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating angle to all of this. So, not that I want to rush us through, but maybe we could take again, not lightning round per se, but like let's kind of bounce through the issues a little bit, and talk about what resonated with us the most. So, we're just past the hour mark. We haven't talked about probably one of the most uh, maybe famous pages, which is the opening one, right? This beautifully concise, fundamental telling of the origin story in those few panels, right? Doomed planet, desperate scientists, last hope, kindly couple. That's it. We did two long episodes a couple of years ago on this podcast on virtually all of the tellings of the origin, and there are so many different ways to tackle it, and it's been done, and I'm sure it will continue to be done. And uh, man, I'm a fan of Superman origin stories, no doubt, but there's something so simple and pure about this, and it's always kind of interesting when you strip something down right to its core essentials. Like what do you ultimately need in order to capture the essence of all of this? And I think they did it in that page.
8 words. I mean, it's beautiful. Again, I keep saying beautiful, but it's the four panels on the very first page show a sequence of events that aren't just unique to this character. Um, they are fundamental in every version of this character. Like this is any Superman comic could open with this page with these texts, and regardless of what the other setting or anything else uh, it's still applicable. That's amazing. Like you talked about distillation. I mean, I can't imagine how long this took, but you take the entire mythology, decades and decades, and adaptations more than anyone else, a symbol that is as popular as anything else the worldwide, and you distill it down to 8 words and 4 panels, and that is amazing. That is, that's a stained glass window. That's a prayer. That is a concept that you want to communicate so clearly. You've reduced it to almost only its most basic parts, and then to turn the page and to get the double page spread of Superman flying. I don't know what the term is, but alongside, underneath, over the sun is it's perfect. It's a statement of purpose. It says, again, this isn't necessarily for the person reading Superman every month. I think they'll enjoy it as well, but this is for anyone who's ever had any interest in the character. This is for you. Pick this up and read this, and please come back next month.
Yeah, I mean, it's so elemental. It just taps into the most salient, relevant parts of this story. And look, again, I love a Superman origin story. There's so much to expand upon and account for how he became this person, but just in these panels alone, born out of the destruction of the planet and this last act of love, right? And ultimately, it is the influence of the people who find him who turn him into this, and you get all of that in those few panels. I've said this on the show before, but I tweeted it recently, not too long ago, and it was what became one of my most liked tweets. I'm glad it resonated with people, but the way I've really come to look at all of this is, Jor-El makes the ultimate Hail Mary pass in shooting that rocket across the stars. And then Jonathan Kent does the most impossible thing. He catches it. Like it's such a beautiful story. And you get that version of it just in those pages there. It's absolutely beautiful. So it's a wonderful way to, kick off the story. And then of course we have Superman saving the man mission to the sun, which has been sabotaged by Luthor, and then he gets his diagnosis. And uh right from the first issue, what becomes a bit of a motto that Superman says throughout the story, and is then even said to him by Lois at a certain point, there's always a way, right? Something that's such an indelible aspect of the character, and I think a very inspiring one, and you get that even from this first issue. I mentioned before about how I love the way Quitely draws generally, but in particular Clark, and sort of this like a lumbering, almost like oafish version of the character. But what's so I love, and I'm sure this comes from both the writing and the art, but I love this notion that when he's being clumsy, he's saving someone, right? It's so great. Like when he bumps into the guy on the street, right? And then something falls from above, and the guy would have been hit if Clark hadn't bumped into him. Like you get
Yeah.
basically any instance where Clark is being clumsy, you have that behind it, which I think is great. And when he's having that conversation with Lois, and you talk about the humanity and how he's processing all of this. No, he doesn't have. We don't get internal, narration, about what he's feeling about this per se. But he asks Lois, very tentatively about, have you thought about, I forget the exact words, but basically, your own mortality or dying, and so like he is wrestling with this. So I like the ways in which this manifests throughout the story, even if it's not so like in your face. Like he is processing it, but again, maybe in more of that Midwestern way, where it's like a less in your face. I also have to say that the notion that he reveals his secret to Lois and she doesn't believe him is brilliant. I I just thought that was such a great twist on this trope, which I'm not a fan of. But again, if we are trying to tell a story that is representative of the larger mythology, not just the triangle era, right? With the larger mythology, Lois not knowing the secret was such a big part of the stories for decades. So, even though, again, going back the first time I read this, I was like, this isn't my Superman and Lois. But I think in totality, it's fitting. But then you get this great twist of her not believing him, which I love that. I was such a fan of that turn.
It, I buy it because, to your point, it harkens back to the literal decades that Superman spent trying to convince Lois that he and Clark weren't the same person. So it's this real like turning it on its head. And even if you don't have that context, again, you know the classic love triangle is, Lois loves Superman, who is really Clark, and Clark loves Lois, and Lois doesn't give him the time of day. I mean, it's beautiful. It's survived 80 years because of its wonderful simplicity, and this idea of her being like, "Oh, you can't be Clark," is wonderful because it's also about denial, because it means that this guy who she was looking down on and standing next to and getting, you know, uh, bylines before her is the same guy she was obsessed with. And this is what he was doing in his off hours. So part of it too is just her not wanting to process it. And I think that's great because when she does, you know, come to believe him and come to see that it's all true and come to see that everything is true, um, she doesn't love him any less. And I think that's great too, because it rewards his faith in her. And I think their entire relationship is perfect. I always go back to the fact that Lois and Lex were both given his powers, and Lex, commits vile acts, and ultimately he comes around. His big, beautiful mind uses the powers to further the cause of science, and he sees how everything's connected, and that moves him, and he comes back down to Earth. And it's not that Lois couldn't do that, but Lois already uh, is so curious about the world that she's constantly describing the things that she can see and experience and hear and feel, and it's this sensory thing, and she's all about it, and she's like, this is wonderful, this is how you are, let's go fight lava men or dinosaur people or whatever it is. And I think that's a really good reflection of what Clark hoped to accomplish with this, because clearly he knows, I'm dying, but I've created a potion that can give my powers to other people. This might come in handy. Let's see what happens, and who's a better test case than Lois, the woman I love. And Lois, of course, does all the right things with it because she's watched him do it. So I think that entire mini arc is perfect. The one thing I will say though is there a less romantic place in the world than the Fortress of Solitude? I just like, I'm taking you to this place that is nothing but ice and crystal, and there's a statue of my dead parents over there, and there's the Titanic and the Challenger, and it's just, I just kept waiting for her to be like, can we go to literally anywhere else but Hoth here, because this is terrifying. But that's just a minor quibble. I was always put off by the Fortress. My favorite Superman hangout is when Jack Kirby had him hang out in the wild area beneath Cadmus in the 70s. I think it was only in a handful of issues, but I was always like, please bring the wild area back.
No, I agree with everything with Lois, and one of my favorite moments in the entire series is at the conclusion of her superpowered day when she says to him, everyone knows what Lois sees in Superman, but like, why me? And he says, I guess there has to be one thing I just can't help. And, he takes her, above the earth, and they share this kiss, and it's very romantic. And again, it's not the version of the character who had, of the characters, the depth and extent and duration of the relationship that they had, but just in this encapsulation of it, I thought it was wonderful. And this idea of Lois, like Lois being the key, like Lois is always going to be his, the tether to his humanity, the piece, whether they are human and grow old and die, or through various machinations live forever. It's like, it has to be Lois. Some of the most notable alternate takes, like Kingdom Come, like Injustice, all centered around, well, what happens when you take her away? Like, she's so central to all of this, and that's where the Snyder movies were going. So it's, again, I think it really taps into that core aspect of Lois. With the identity thing, there's one moment in the last or second to last issue, and I'm sure I'm reading too much into this, but it's when Clark is at the Daily Planet, and he's really fading now. It's after he's fought Solaris, but now he has to contend with Lex. And he stands up to Lex, and everyone just assumes that he's Superman posing as Clark. And Jimmy says, and this is where I know I'm reading too much into this, but Jimmy says, and I quote, "Nice disguise, Superman." And I just like, I don't know, did that make you think about anything? Because I'm saying to myself, like, well, what if it's not that they can't believe this, but what if it's like they just are so committed to the bit, like committed to going along with his ruse? I don't know. In that moment, I was like, well, maybe Jimmy, maybe it's not that they don't believe it, but it's again, maybe not so much with Lois, but with some of the other characters, I just couldn't help but think that.
Well, I think no, I think that's true with Jimmy Olsen. I
Yeah.
think that's always been true with Jimmy Olsen. I think Jimmy like Jimmy Olsen knows Clark Kent is Superman, but for whatever reason, he also respects his friend for wanting to keep them separate. And I just, yeah, to me, that's just, I won't say it's canon, but to me, it's just like, yeah, of course Jimmy knows. Like Jimmy is his sidekick. Jimmy Olsen is Superman's sidekick. He's been that way since before even Supergirl was created. Like, he knows the two of them are the same. He respects his friend too much to call attention to it, and he probably is hoping that one of them will reveal that to him. But no, Jimmy's got too much world experience. Jimmy's the only member of the Daily Planet staff who's as comfortable with the absurd and the supernatural as he is with the mundane and the day to day. So no, I read that as Morrison saying Jimmy Olsen clearly knows these two are the same people. He's just too nice to say anything about it.
Yeah, I like that reading of it as well. And on the note of Jimmy, I feel like All Star gives us one of the best Jimmy Olsen treatments that we've gotten, where it
Yeah,
taps into everything that I think you would want. And I'm referring specifically to issue 4, where Superman is exposed to black kryptonite, right, and goes bad, and Jim has to save him, and he does so by uh, essentially becoming Doomsday, right? Like Doomsday was this biological weapon that was created, and Jimmy injects himself with it, and he becomes this monster. And I love the bit that the signal watch was kind of the tether that allowed him to return to normal. So I thought that was great. But it gives you Jimmy Olsen and his the amazing transformations of Jimmy Olsen, right? Like all these weird these weird transformations that he went through, and especially in those wacky Silver Age stories. Like it gives you that. It gives you him as his pal, but again, just as far as like a little twist on it, not a pal who's being rescued, but who's actually doing the rescuing. Like I love as Superman is starting to change as he's experiencing the effects of black kryptonite. He's like, "Jim, I'm in a jam." I love that phrase, but he's like, "I need help." And the fact that, yeah, maybe he was the only one who was there, but I feel like either way, like he would turn to Jim, and I really really like that. And even just on the journalism side, this is a very accomplished Jim Olsen. He's got his
yeah.
4 a day Sunday feature where he, lives in as these various roles and reports on it. And it just felt like such a fully realized Jimmy. I've not yet read that Matt Fraction miniseries, which I know you're a big fan of, and we'll get to that down the line on the podcast. But I always kind of, Jim's always a character where I long for a little bit more, and I think this is such a great take on him where he still retains the core attributes of what you would want out of a Jimmy Olsen, but is also capable and shows that he's deserving of the Superman pal moniker. Like he really proves it. I love this Jimmy.
Uh, and you're leaving out the best part. When he turns back and Superman is okay, he yells to a bunch of bystanders, "Don't let anybody see him like this." And
Yep.
it's the only time he yells at the entire time. The fundamental aspect of Jimmy Olsen is that he is as protective of Superman as Superman is of every single person in the world. That's why their relationship is different. That's why Jimmy gets the level of contact that he does, not just because um, he happens to work with Clark, or you need someone to talk to, or whatever the reason. At the end of the day, it's like, no, Jimmy's going to protect you. Jimmy's going to do what sidekicks do. You get in trouble, and I'm there, and I'm used to this nonsense. And I love that about him, because I love the idea that Superman is able to endear this into another person. And this has the added weight of, this guy probably knows you're pretending to be Clark, and he's not judging you for it. He's also looking at you and saying, "Oh, okay, but every once in a while, you are going to need help. You've needed help in the past. You're going to need it again. I'm down for that. I'm absolutely 100% ready to do this. You need me to take some weird experimental formula, not to save you, but to make sure you don't hurt anyone else? Yeah, absolutely." And then once that's done, I'm going to make sure that, no one ever says, "Hey, Superman went bad one time." It's like, no, he didn't. He absolutely didn't. He had a bad day. He's okay now. Everything's going to be okay. We should all be so lucky as to have a Jimmy Olsen in our lives.
For sure, for sure. And towards the end of that, as the Black K infected Superman is getting weaker, he's kind of losing it. He says Superman can't die or something to that effect. So again, I think another instance where he is wrestling with the fate that has befallen him. It's just again typically taking these altered states or whatever the case may be, or when he's in his Clark Kent guise where it's coming out, right? So maybe not the way we typically see it, but it is there. You mentioned before about how maybe the fortress is not super romantic. I don't disagree with that. I've you know, I'm totally on board with the fortress being the place where he communes with Jor-El and learns about his heritage and things like that. I've never been the biggest fan of the more Silver Age iteration where it's, I don't know, almost more Batcave-esque in terms of the mementos.
Yeah.
And I can't really put my finger on why necessarily, although it just, part of me again goes back to that idea of him being a little bit more, that version being a little bit more removed from his humanity. I mean, maybe that's why. But and I'll also say this super curious Superman who's recreating the menu from the Titanic on the Titanic and creating potions or serums for Lois and copying genetic code. I bump up against that a little bit because that to me doesn't feel like Clark on the farm, but I can reconcile it. What really made me understand this version of the fortress and actually really love it is when he says to Lois, it's not a museum, it's a time capsule. And one day future generations will enter and they'll know what it was like to be at the dawn of the age of superheroes. And I just to myself, it's like, yeah, it's not that he's just like collecting this stuff. There's more behind it. And we get such a great payoff in the Smallville issue where there's that time, what was it called? Not Time Eater, but
Chronivore.
The Chronivore. And the Superman squad says like we only knew about this because of the photo that Lana Lang took at the Smallville diner where we saw it in the photo that was preserved in the fortress. So, this idea of it being a time capsule that actually pays off down the line. It again, especially this more Silver Age-esque iteration of the fortress, it really made me understand it in a way that I didn't before. I really like it now. So I enjoyed that a lot too.
I I always come back to something. The Bat Cave is what someone who didn't have a childhood thinks your childhood room should be like. It's filled with all of the stuff that, you like and you have good memories of and you have control over. And no one else comes in my room, even though, his dad comes in and cleans up occasionally and his friends come over. Um, and the fortress is like that at the same time, except it's distant and remote because it's a place where Clark can go to think, like Doc Savage before him, who also had an Arctic fortress. Um, but I always go back to my favorite headquarters in the DC universe is the Flash Museum. And I love the idea that the Flash, and there's no one more Midwestern than the Flash, has a place where he says, hey, listen, I did a bunch of cool things. I want to share them with you. I want you to come by and I want you to see. And this is my buddy Len. He's a criminal, but it's okay. He broke out of prison once. He was there for his brother. Things are cool now. Or like, this is all my stuff. This is my girlfriend. I can't tell you her real name and all this other stuff. And part of me wants that here too. It's like there'd be a great version of the Fortress of Solitude set up on the outskirts of Metropolis, which is supposed to be, New York on a good day. Or people could just wander through and be like, oh man, the Titanic, this is great. Let's go aboard. Let's see what it was really like in this this thing from 100 years ago. So again, I just go back to a lot of it's fine. A lot of it's great, and it's really good. But I just why do you got to be so aloof? Why do you got to be so out there? It's just like the whole issue with Lois suffering from paranoia and worrying about what is going on in there works so well as a horror story because again like the place is terrifying, like it's just it's cavernous because it is a literal cavern, but it's also drawn to be very austere because it's just Clark and a bunch of robots. So I don't know, I don't really know what I'm trying to say. I just if Superman 2 or Superman Secondus or whatever the next one is called decides to set up the Super Museum in whatever their version of Queens is, I think people would get a lot more use out of that.
Fair enough. Fair enough. When they're in the fortress, that's also where we meet the baby Sun Eater that he's feeding. And we also have, again, another Silver Age staple, the Superman robots. And, we're not even talking people here, but my whole George Bailey, It's a Wonderful Life thing, applies here as well. It's like, when we get to the later parts in the story, we have this Sun Eater come to Superman's rescue against the Tyrant Sun, as do all of the robots, except the one who has to stay behind to to maintain the fortress and the species that are alive there. So again, just this idea of these good, kind deeds that he performs for everyone and everything throughout the story, and how that comes back around, and not that he does it for any repayment, but it's what he inspires in everyone around him. It's just a wonderful representation of all of that. So the as far as Lois's birthday and Atlas and Samson and their whole play for Lois's affections and all of that. I mean, the balls on these two guys, where we find, they challenge Superman to this contest, right, to win Lois's affections. And she's kind of annoyed with Superman for all this business about pretending to be Clark Kent. And so she kind of goes along with it. And this is where, again, the humanity, where you see, Superman pulls her aside, like, why are you flirting with these guys? And he even says to one of them, he's like, I don't like you. He's like, I don't like you much. That's where, again, it's like, man, I feel like it's like Kansas in him coming out, and I love it. But, ultimately what we find out is that they stole, right, this radioactive Netflix necklace from the Sphinx, who's been chasing them across time and dimensions. And they lured it here because they knew they needed Superman's help. And this is where we get the question, the unanswerable question, one of his feats that he must account for. What happens when the unstoppable force meets the immovable object? And of course, they surrender. I've always, it's so funny, man. It's been, almost 20 years since these issues came out, and or at
Yeah.
least since the first few issues came out. And I from time to time, not every day like you with Superman Beyond, but from time to time, I really do think of that surrender moment. As it's such a great bit. But it's like right after that, they go back to challenging him. It's like, this guy just saved your asses. And I don't know. I mean, I guess they are jerks, right? And they deserved what they got when he shatters their arms in the arm wrestling contest. But it's just like, really?
I love that scene when he breaks their arms because it's the one time he acts really petty. And I think that's great because, normally he'll put you back in jail, put you in the phantom zone. He'll do all of these things to make sure that you can't hurt yourself or someone else. But you flirt with his girlfriend when he is finally ready to make a significant commitment, he will break your arm. I don't care if you are Solomon or Atlas or again the Kryptonian astronauts or whatever else. Don't mess with this woman, and I like that because not that she can't defend herself and not that she isn't completely capable of getting rid of these two idiots on her own, but he's mad, and that's a very honest human emotion. He's mad and he's jealous and she knows it, and I love it. And I love that entire issue for that reason that these two guys can do all of these amazing things. They can, convince a reptilian army to invade Metropolis. They can fight the Ultra Sphinx. They can, you know, they can do all of these things, but ultimately at the end of the day, all they can think of is, well, how can we annoy him? Right? How can we bother him? How can we show him we're better than him? Superman doesn't spend one single second of his day even thinking about these guys. Um, and again, it goes back to what I was saying before, which is so many characters in these 12 issues are poor reflections of Superman to show what Superman isn't. And I love the way they describe what they're going to do to win Lois's affections because it's all feats of strength. They're going to make diamonds and they're going to make people bow and they're going to do everything. They're talking to a woman who, for the day, is stronger than both of them, and they can't even see that. And that's the point. Clark didn't give her powers because, from some selfish reason. He gave her powers because he thought she might enjoy herself, and she does because he knows her really well, probably better than anyone else alive. Um, and that's kind of the point. It's like, yeah, she's going to flirt with the two meatheads because it's going to make him angry, and he almost never gets angry. He gets angry enough to break both of their arms and send them on their merry way. And I think that's a great scene because it goes back to what I was saying, which is like, yeah, he's got all the highest ideals in the world, but at the end of the day, he loves Lois, full stop.
Full stop. It's not just the feats of strength, though, Mike. Don't forget the time travel aspect. They promise her drinks at the crucifixion. Haven't you always wanted that? It's like, okay.
Oh yeah, I think Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster would have really appreciated their characters having drinks at the crucifixion, whatever that means.
So if it's cool with you, I would love to jump to because we talked about the Jimmy issue, we talked about the Lex issue. I know we didn't pour over every page and every panel, but
Hmm.
I think we've hit probably the most resonant pieces of those issues. The Smallville issue, where it's unclear at the outset exactly what's going on here. Is this just a flashback issue? And then of course you realize the time travel component that these new farmhands who have come on to work at the Kent farm are actually the time traveling Superman squad there to combat the Chronivore, and that the bandaged unknown Superman, or not even a Superman, but this bandaged farmhand is actually our Superman, and that this has allowed him the opportunity to have the goodbye with Jonathan Kent that he was robbed of at the time because he was busy as Superboy trying to fight the Chronivore. A couple of things I've said many times, and we are getting into we will get to a big Superboy exploration on this podcast probably next year, but I swear it's coming. Still though, Superboy, Crypto, these are aspects that still remain a little bit tough for me. I they don't line up again with necessarily my vision of the character. I don't have that childhood attachment or anything like that, but again, I can take a step back and I can look at if you are, so it's such a big part of the character's history, publishing history, right? So to tell an all-star story, it's like, yeah, it's fitting to have time as Superboy with Crypto represented there. So I'm on board with that. And of course, I always feel at home in Smallville. I love the scene with Clark, Lana, and Pete at the diner. And after Clark leaves, Lana says to Pete, like, are you guys just like, how can you expect me to pretend like I don't know who he is? Which I thought that was great. I love that
Yeah.
moment.
Yeah, yeah, no, that was my favorite moment in the issue because again, it goes back to what I was saying about Jimmy. Like Superman protects everyone, absolutely everyone, but there are people who protect Clark, and if you know Clark, and again, you're not the world's greatest investigative reporter or the smartest man who's ever lived, you very quickly see like, wait, you're the same person, like you're my best friend and the guy who just saved the milk truck or whatever it is that Superboy gets up to day. You're clearly the same person. Like you don't want to tell me that, so I'm going to respect that for you. But yeah, the idea that Pete and Lana knew these things, that perfectly lines up with my understanding because um, they're there at the outset. They're the original apostles, right? They're there as he's figuring out, well, I have the strength, um, and I have the values, but what am I going to do with those? And what am I going to do with those in a way that would help people and would make those that I already have in my life proud of me? Because again, I think, why does he become Superman? Well, at the end of the day, Martha and Jonathan tell him it's a good idea to do so. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. It's like, I forget if it's in this comic or some other one where it's like Martha Kent clips every article of Superman ever, and she's got the whole storm cellar is just filled with this, and I love that because it's like this guy saves the world on a daily basis, and she gets every newspaper and she clips everything because she couldn't be more proud of her son doing all of these things. And I really like that because it proves that Clark is incredibly human and these people are endeared to him. And I just, again, it's a little thing and it's a quick thing, but again, a small act of humanity is what ultimately saves the day. To go back to your earlier point, Cal Kent says, well, if Lana hadn't taken this picture, aka if she hadn't cared about you as a person, not as a super person, we wouldn't have been able to come back and save the day and give you a couple of seconds with your dad. So it's perfect. It really, really is. It's a flawless issue. For me, it's only surpassed by issue 10, but it's damn good comics.
Yeah, it's absolutely terrific. It's probably my favorite issue of the series, I would say. And look, as the Smallville series finale taught us, it was his time in Smallville with Jonathan and Martha Kent and all the people there that made him a hero. And I have to say the eulogy really gets me, and I talked about that before. But it's the one panel that I tear up every time when Jonathan is standing out in that field with the bandaged farmhand, which is our present day Superman. And he just says, and I guess if you were reading this maybe more literally, he could have been talking about Clark, kind of deciding what path to follow, more immediately. We get some information about Jonathan and Martha. Martha wants to go back to live in the town and manage the general store, but I think the true meaning of this exchange is, Jonathan knows that it's his time, right? And I
Yeah.
think has some sense, maybe not that the bandaged man is literally his son from the future, but has some sense that there's something more about him. And so it's really a much bigger question when he says he'll be okay, won't he? The boy. And and of course Superman says, it all turns out right in the end. But it's just like, and I know, as a dad, it's like, if that's all you would need to know, right? Like if
Yeah.
you knew that were it, though, that's the only question. It's like, and if your kid is all right, it's okay. So I love that. I love that scene so much. It's I again that's why, and great respect for the late Dwayne McDuffie. And I don't mean to dump on the animated movie, but and I actually, there are not, you expressed this earlier, and a few people who I've heard from have said that the animated movie kind of unlocked a lot of this for them and made them
Yeah.
fans of it. So it definitely has value. And I'll also, in fairness to Dwayne McDuffie, this this is not a story built designed for a 3-act movie. Like, I think
No.
that's ultimately the problem with adapting this, which is, to Morrison's credit, like they told a story made for the medium of comics, right?
Yeah.
It is always so funny to me though when this comes up when we talk about Death of Superman, and it comes up now, these stories, though these two in particular, that seem tailor made for an episodic approach. They're always adapted in movie form. It's like they don't, some work, to a greater degree than others, but it's like I don't feel like that's necessarily the best vehicle for them. So I think that's ultimately, that's probably the biggest problem that I had with the movie, was just like this wasn't made to be a movie. It doesn't have the flow or the structure or the pacing of it, and so ultimately what you get is again, largely a direct translation with a lot of omission. So it's, I think ultimately it's a good way to see the comic, brought to life. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know how often I would really revisit the movie. I would definitely continue to go back to the comic. So
Yeah. It's not. All Star Superman is like Watchmen. It was made to be a comic first, and it was never. As far as I know, it wasn't designed with adaptation in mind. All Star really plays to the episodic format of the issues. I mean, characters and arcs are introduced that are gone by the end of the issue, and that's fine because the narrative thread is picked up and things build on themselves. But again, you can read the parasite in prison scene, or the two issues with the bizarre world on their own. Like things continue and move on, but ultimately those are the adventures of Superman. Again, I just go back to McDuffie saying this thing wasn't meant to be adapted, but I love it, so I'm going to do my best. And since it was Dwayne McDuffie, who's again was a legend before he even wrote this thing, he does an amazing job. And what he has to change to fit a 90-minute structure is to try to make it uh a single episode. And would I love to watch an all-star Superman show? Yes, that would be great. Please make that HBO Max. But if we just have that movie, then that's good too.
very recently, just days before this recording, new co-head of DC Films, James Gunn, posted an image of himself, or not of himself, but of All Star Superman next to his cup of coffee, fueling speculation about what he has in mind for the Superman movie he's writing. So, but again, we're still in the realm of movies, but we'll see. I think there's uh, people, we might be getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here, but you never know. And maybe even if it's not a literal translation or adaptation, maybe aspects of it will inspire the movie. So we'll see. The
Way back in the day before the movie had actually come out, I was very excited for Man of Steel because the trailer takes Jor-El's speech that Jor-El is able to give to his son in this very comic. And I thought, well, that's a really good sign because that's one of the best, I don't know, monologues, pieces of dialogue, what have you, of him. They will follow you into the sun is poetry. And hearing that in the Man of Steel trailer way back in the day did make me very excited for that movie. So yeah, I think that people who want to make movies of Superman since this thing has come out, you know, they clearly read it.
Jumping ahead, but that whole sequence where, Superman's essentially having a near death experience, right? The equivalent of that, and sees Jor-El, and but it's so Morrison where it's all this business about, you know, uh, energy can't be created or destroyed, so it's like you're being converted into this radio consciousness or however it's described, but
Yeah.
it has that great effect, and it allows for that moment between them, and yes, that very powerful line. It's I love the way it's delivered and presented in Man of Steel, and that's always what I hear in my head. So I do gravitate towards that, though I appreciate the its origin in the comic here. But even before that, when Jor-El says, "You showed them the face of the man of tomorrow," is such a great line, and that whole sequence. But kind of jumping back to the where we left off here, and going back to the animated movie. So the animated movie entirely skips the Bizarro sequence. And I actually do think very cleverly, if I remember correctly, right, it's Superman going off with Candor, right, and then there's a big break, and then he returns, as opposed to here where he's off world for a while on Bizarro World, right, after the Bizarros attack Earth in issue 7, and then issue 8 he's off on Bizarro World. What I'm not the biggest Bizarro fan. I like a certain flavor of Bizarro. I don't quite love the whole Bizarro world aspect necessarily, uh, but I enjoyed this for what it was. What did you think about the Bizarro detour?
I hate Bizarro speech. I hated it in the Silver Age. I hate it in the modern age. I hated it in this. I don't get it. I don't find it appealing. The joke wears very thin very quickly. Um, I love Bizarro World here because I love the idea that um, Bizarro World is the macro organism and it's hunting Earth. And the Bizarros are just its amoebas, small life forms that are forming on it, including Superman and including Lois and including all the other characters because that's what it's seeing on Earth. And it's a dumb, primitive organism from a less complicated, a less complex version of the universe. They refer to it as the underverse, so it doesn't understand that that's not going to work, but it's trying it anyway. I think that's great. I think that's a high concept. Um, I also like that Bizarro here is tied into the Bizarro drones that Quintum is creating in the issue 1. I like, again, I said that Superman analogs and duplicates and other versions are all throughout this thing. Bizarro is the original version of that. Back in the Silver Age, Lex Luthor attempted to create his own version of Superman, but when he did, he created Bizarro instead, who isn't able to be controlled, even though he has all of Superman's powers. Um, and I thought that that was fun here, where Leo, the smartest person alive, I guess, except for Lex, can't clone Superman. He tries and he tries and he tries, and all he comes up with is these Bizarros who can be set to a specific purpose, but they're not Superman. Um, and it's the same way on Bizarro World, where you can create a version of Superman who has his strength and who does all these other things, but they're not him, and we're going to show you why. But my favorite thing about that arc by far is Zibaro, which is an original creation, and the idea being, well, if Bizarro is Superman over a certain axis, well, whatever it is. Zabaro is Bizarro reflected back over that same axis, but it's a copy of a copy of a copy, and what you get is this like I always think of him as a Neil Gaiman-esque person because he asked Superman to read his poetry, and that just seems like something that would have happened in the old Vertigo Sandman book. But I love him because he's so dour and he's so ridiculous, and he's got this off red costume, and all he wants is Superman to say, "Yes, you have it so bad," while Superman is sweating and dying and going through all these other things. And I thought the character was great, and even at his absolutely lowest ebb, Superman is still trying to make this guy feel a little bit better about things because there is no one in existence other than Superman who knows what it feels like to be alone in the world. Even if you do have friends, they still can't understand everything you go through. So I really enjoyed those two parts, but I was also happy not to have them in the movie because again, every time one of these characters has to speak, it's just like, please stop it. We get it. We get the joke. They say things backwards. Okay, great. Stop it. I'm not even reading the dialogue at this point. I'm skipping over it.
I'm with you. Just as a side note, my water heater is going off right now, so if you hear a little background noise, that's what it is. It'll kick off in a couple of minutes. But wonderful assessment of the Bizarro detour. It's so funny because every time Bizarro comes up, I talk about how I don't like the Bizarro speak, and I've only ever had people share a similar sentiment. So like, if there's anyone out there who loves this backward speak, please let me know because it's one of these things where it's like, would people please just drop this? It's so annoying. It's so annoying to read. But I agree. Zabaro is great. Here's again where like Silver Age and Morrison just I feel like it's like peanut butter and chocolate because I'm reading and I'm saying to myself, look, my Silver Age knowledge is has grown but is still limited. I'm like, oh, this must be some kind of Silver Age pull, right? That Morrison dusted off or something like that. But I know this the original for this, but it totally makes sense either way. As a wholly original Morrison creation, yep, that absolutely tracks. But if this had been something out of the Silver Age that Morrison drew from, that would make sense too. I can't. I wish I could take credit for this, but I think credit goes to Adam talking Superman on Twitter. I think he had posted this whole idea again about Superman. I think the way Adam actually put it was Superman going through the 5 stages of grief over his impending doom, and how this really represents the depression stage. Like he's trapped in the underverse. It's like the crushing weight of this. I mean, literally, he can't leave the planet, but emotionally, spiritually, in terms of what he's going through and the struggle over his demise. That this is a manifestation of that, which I thought was a really. I wish I had thought of that, but I read that I was like, yeah, that actually is really brilliant. You know, is that something that you had thought about at all?
Uh, yeah, I think of I think of the Bizarro world as kind of a stand-in for hell, for depression, for these ideas of you don't want to be here, you are here. How do we get out? Um, but for Superman, it's particularly bad because again, it's Bizarro world. Like it's a world built around the idea that well, these guys love Bizarro as much as humans love you, except this world is terrible and awful, and no one here is going to be able to help you get what you want. So I really did enjoy that, but I also love the idea of a Superman story built around Superman having to escape a dying world because I really thought that that put him in Jor-El's shoes. So I love all the scenes where he's trying to convince the Bizarros to assemble a rocket in time, and doing his best to make sure Zabaro doesn't drop the ball, and knowing he has to get on this, knowing he has to escape, and it's just this it's this weird inversion of what his father had to go through, where no one was listening and no one was going to help him, and there was only one person who understood how important that was, and it's either Jor-El or Superman, depending on the version of the story. So yeah, I thought it was a great way to externalize what Clark must have been going through, which is just this abject loneliness. But again, yeah, please, no more Bizarro speak, guys. Please, I'm begging you.
Yeah, for real. I thought it was such a great touch when Superman returns to Earth that he lands near like a carnival, right? Given the old
Yeah.
circus strongman origins of his look back in the 30s, I thought that was such a nice nod. And of course, a lot of time has passed. My water heater has kicked off, so that's great. And he flies back to Metropolis, and these lost Kryptonian astronauts have set themselves up here on Earth, and we and Superman quickly realize that their intentions for Earth are not as warm or benign as Superman's are. And again, this is just another example, I think, of how the kindness prevails, right? Because they're cruel and they're so dismissive of him, right? And they look at this as the site for new Krypton. I mean, again, talking about the tropes that Morrison plays. I mean, this idea of, maybe with the exception of Kandor, which we'll get to in the next issue, it's like typically when Kryptonians show up, from Phantom Zone or otherwise, regardless of how initially good they might seem, inevitably it goes wrong for all the reasons we've always talked about, right? What makes Superman who he is, of course, this upbringing and the humanity, but so I think to get an aspect of that represented here, I thought was great and very fitting, but also I think a good payoff, because it's not just that he defeats them, right? They are ultimately exposed to some kryptonite cloud, right, in space or something like that, and they're dying. And he shows them kindness, and they appreciate that and kind of see the light, right, and are proud to call him kin,
Yeah.
despite the way they had treated him previously. And they even get their moment of redemption where he's like, they agree to be sent into the Phantom Zone.
Yeah.
And Superman even says, like, all right, at least I know there'll be some law and order there. And the last shot of
Yeah.
them, like ready to crack some heads in the Phantom Zone, I thought was such a nice payoff and an arc, and very quick but effective, I thought.
I like knowing that everyone on Krypton was a dick. I don't think that gets talked about enough, but these people said Jor-El. Jor-El is the Lex Luthor or the Leo Quintum of Krypton, right? He's the smartest guy who's ever lived. He's 6 generations smarter than everyone else, and he's telling you, like, the giant red sun in the sky is going to destabilize us, and we're not going to be here very much longer. And everyone's like, nah, nah. So he has to act, and every time we've seen other Kryptonians, to your point, they never land very well. Things always come up with friction. So I love the idea that these two would have been regarded as superheroes, right? They were the first astronauts. They were legendary. They were, Lilo and Bar-El. They were great, good model Kryptonians. They only have to be on Earth for like 12 hours before they become fascists. And I think that's really interesting because it says, well, Clark, maybe you're happy you didn't necessarily grow up there. You definitely would have been an outsider from a house of outsiders, and goodness only knows how that would have turned out. So I thought that was great here because Clark being raised on Earth is why they survive, because to your point, he constantly looks for a chance to have empathy with other people. And again, if they can survive and they can live here, um, they could replace him, they could help him, they could continue the good work, they could do all of these things, to say nothing of the fact that they were raised on Krypton. They probably have cures for cancer we're not going to discover for who knows how much longer, buried in whatever spacecraft brought them here. So Clark is immediately excited by this, but again, there's a reason Krypton's not here anymore. It fell. It wasn't ready to save itself, and the astronauts are a really good example of that. But yeah, to your point, that last scene where they're like, "Oh, we were given a second chance," well, you can bet we're not going to waste it. And please, 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 give me a mini series where these two are dealing with Zod and Valor and all the other characters trapped in there. Please, Steve Gerber, the late great Steve Gerber, wrote a mini series about the Phantom Zone criminals long ago, and it's one of my favorite Superman stories. And if someone wants to revisit that with these two characters added in, I would happily buy it.
Yeah, same here. I think that would be awesome. But yeah, I mean, and just another example of his seemingly infinite patience and kindness, and willing to give people a chance. And even going back to Lex, it's like there's never really any animosity on the part of Superman, right, towards him, and it's always, as both Clark and Superman, but especially as Clark, like seemingly this genuine attempt to understand. I mean, there's that moment, and I'm going back here, but when Clark says to Lex, he's like basically pleading with him. He's like, "You guys could have been friends."
Yeah.
Again, I think just a lot of great examples of showing, what Superman, what he sees in people, and but again, more importantly, what it inspires. So
Yeah. Well, it goes back to what you said about the line about the deep psychology. Lex can't imagine having omnipotence and being that, from his perspective, ineffectual with it, not just doing whatever it is you thought was best, regardless of the consequences. Well, it's the same for Superman. Superman can't wrap his head around someone whose entire life is defined by hatred. To him, that's a waste. And especially if you're Lex, someone who could do whatever they chose to do, whatever they set their mind to it, Superman is constantly trying to understand this. Like, why do you hate like this? What is it about the way you live your life that couldn't be fixed by just helping me or not being a dick? Like all of these things. And it's these two guys who really can't get to where the other person is because they're both missing a fundamental component. Lex can't understand that Superman is all good. And, Superman can't understand that this guy just doesn't believe in him, doesn't trust him, doesn't think that he's real, thinks he must be lying. So these two guys are constantly looking at each other like, what the hell is wrong with you? And again, it's not until the end where they're both on equal footing where they're like, oh, now I get it. But again, it's a great arc.
look, any Superman Lex story that whether Superman loses his powers or Lex gains them, where they can actually have a physical confrontation, I'm always down for when a true punch can be thrown. Some of my
Yeah.
favorite Smallville moments. So, we're at one of the final issues here, number 10, the last will and testament issue, which I know is a favorite of yours and of mine as
Yeah.
well. And I love the structure of this where you're following Superman. We're cutting back and forth, but we're kind of following him on his day where the end is drawing down, and he's not rushing through his to-do list, but you see him. You kind of see him taking these steps, finding a home for Candor, right? Or with the assistance of Leo Quintum, this idea
Yeah.
of releasing the city still miniaturized, but on Mars, where they'll have their own space, but they'll have the power of the sun. And yeah, I just think such a great payoff to this, to about unanswerable questions, like what do you do with Candor? And I did like that outcome. And you mentioned a minute ago about the Kryptonians could probably cure disease. Well, through Superman, through Superman's benevolence, that's what happens, right? So this whole issue where the Kandorians are in Superman's bloodstream trying to stop this solar radiation poisoning. Ultimately, they're unable to, but Superman knew that all along, right? But they made him feel well enough to go about his business of the day. But he has the idea that this application, what they were trying to do for him, while it might not have worked on for this condition for his physiology, that they probably could eradicate any and all human diseases. So as far as it's maybe this is something that totally jumps out at people and really makes an impression. I don't know. In my past readings, for whatever reason, it didn't smack me in the face the way that it did now, where it's like he cures disease. It's
Yeah.
incredible.
This issue is perfect. This is the best issue of the entire series. This is one of my favorite comic books of all time. This might be one of the best comic books of all time. Yeah, and the one thing you didn't mention that I love most of all is he stands before the infinite universe containing Earth Q, and he says, "Well, I have to see what a world would be like without me, because I'm afraid that once I go away, humanity is not going to be able to survive on its own. So I need to see if it's possible." Um, that they would. So what does he do? He creates life. Well, the life is us. It's the world of the reader. Earth Q is us. It's a world without superhumans. It's a world that exists, wrapped around the fictional world. And you see, dispersed throughout this issue, what are Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster going about the process of creating Superman. And you see the beginnings of art and culture on random panels featuring Aborigine characters. And it's the evolution of this idea of Superman being the the ultimate example of art. We didn't just make him in a vacuum. He is the development of all these things. And I think what Morrison is trying to say here is, in a world without Superman, in a world without superhumans, in a world without that potential, we still need him. So what do? We create him as a fictional character. And in this story, that same fictional character created us. And it's talking, again, just like in Final Crisis, about the relationship between the reader and the fiction and the consummation, and how even though it's fiction and it doesn't exist, it does, because it has an effect on you and you take it with you, whether you're me and you're thinking about Superman Beyond every day, or you go back to the most powerful panel in this entire series, which is Reagan on the ledge, which is constantly cited by people who say this page saved lives. This is very simple. This is a fictional character saving a life by explaining to a young woman, your doctor was late. I'm sorry. I had to fight a robot aboard a train. It was completely out of your control, but I'm here now. And he hugs her and she doesn't die. And that's beautiful. And yeah, it's so great. And then yeah, to have an issue that ends with Superman deciding that, well, what's the best use of candor? Well, you're going to cure childhood cancer. It's like, yeah, that's a Superman story I want to read. It's not self-indulgent. It's not him standing on a mountain and saying I've cured all disease. It's very specific. It's saying these are children. They haven't had a chance yet. I'm going to take the Kandorians who want to do this, and I'm going to let them do this, and I'm going to see what happens. And it's this beautiful thing of hope. It's this beautiful idea that we're given, and that final panel on the final page of Joe Shuster drawing the Golden Age Superman just chokes me up every time. I love this comic. I really do. I wish I had a stack of these things. I would just hand it to everyone that I saw on the street. Like this is every single thing I have wanted from this lifelong hobby.
It really is tremendous. And yes, that page with the jumper on the roof is something that you see a lot, and rightfully so. This notion of it's never as bad as it seems, and you're stronger than you think you are. It's such a for all that he can do with his abilities, right? It's the words and just being there, and the fact that he's there for her
Yeah.
in that instant, just as he was there for that mission to Mars, to Bizarro, whatever the situation is, right? He's there to help. It's so powerful, and it wasn't until probably this last reading where it even dawned on me that when he's receives that message from the future, it's the descendant of Reagan warning him
Yeah.
about Solaris, which again that
Yeah.
was lost on me the first time through that future speak, but again George Bailey of it all, of these acts of kindness coming back around in a really beautiful way. This issue in particular, this entire series, this notion of Superman dealing with his mortality. So the entire series, but especially this issue, yeah, there are a couple of Silver Age stories. The Last Days of Superman, where he thinks he's dying from a Kryptonian virus, and he kind of makes his to-do list. It reminded me of that. And then also the Superman Silver Age, Superman Red, Superman Blue story, where the Kandorians are basically like, "Hey, you suck. You never got us out of this bottle. What are you going to do about it?" And so he conducts this experiment on himself to enhance his intelligence. He splits himself in two. But now that there are two Supermen, both with super intelligence, he's able to solve all these problems, including restoring Kandor to its original size, bringing Krypton back. It's really a whole thing. One of them lives on Krypton with Lois, the other one lives on Earth with Lana. It's a whole thing. But uh, again, I have to imagine that those stories were at least somewhat an inspiration for Morrison. Obviously, played here for far more dramatic effect, but you see the echoes of those stories, and I really think that's cool. And you encapsulated it beautifully. I don't have much more to add about the pocket universe he creates, other than just that this idea that, right, you said, in a world where there's no Superman, we create one. Like, the idea of Superman and what Superman represents is so undeniable. I also love, and maybe this kind of brings it full circle, because I know, we've already talked about a lot of the end of the story, his fight with Solaris, the Sun Eater and the robots coming to his defense, the final confrontation with Lex, the farewell to Lois flying into the sun, that final shot of him working the gears or whatever it is he's doing in the heart of the sun, the final tease that there's a future generation of Superman to come. But in a lot of ways, bringing this full circle, when he's making his last will and testament, what he leaves to Clark Kent is the headline, right, of Superman's death. And he says to Clark Kent, who never let me forget what it feels like to be an ordinary, downtrodden man. And I'm with you. I've never liked, certainly, I never ascribed to the Kill Bill speech. But even, and I've talked about this, right? I do bristle against the, as much as I love the Christopher Reeve performance like that, really that bumbling caricature of the character, the Clark Kent who's purely a disguise, right? But again, in this context, I think it works, and I liked that articulation from Superman about what Clark Kent has allowed him to do and to experience, and that Clark gets his due in that moment, and then again even later when he stands up to Lex in the Daily Planet, it's like even Clark has his moment in all of this. So I just it really it worked for me in so many ways.
Yeah, I do like that Superman is self-aware of it. I think that's important too because again, he could have chosen any identity he wanted. He designed this version of Clark, not the version he grew up with, but this version of him, and he could have very well designed one that Lois would have been more interested in, but he didn't. He designed this one specifically so that he could live the kind of the other side of things. He lets Steve Lombard play pranks on him and do all this other like weird sitcom-y stuff. And he never takes his revenge on him. It's not like with Atlas and the other one because
He does
it's
light Steve's toupee on fire, so he,
he
he does do
he
that.
does light Steve's toupee on fire. He does. He gets it. He gets it where he can. And I'd love to read the story where Steve really does realize like you were messing with Superman. Like he wasn't he was playing along. He was in on the joke basically. So I do think that's important, and I like the fact that he's self-aware about it because I do think it's really interesting. But it also begs the question of well, when he is Superman and when he's actively not being Clark, well, how much of that is also an act? Because if Clark Kent was raised on a farm and his parents know him as one thing and Lana and Pete
Pete.
know him as one thing. When he decides to go off into the world, he almost bifurcates that personality, and Superman becomes stronger and more dedicated and more stoic, to borrow your word. And then Clark becomes more mundane and more unnoticeable and everything else. So it's kind of a sacrifice he makes because he knows he's going to need that. He's going to need that tether. So, I mean, it's not my favorite aspect of the character, but again, it's certainly not done poorly, and I do like the fact that it's acknowledged here because he knows what he's doing. It's not just a narrative conceit. The character knows what he's doing.
I think that's the thing where I can get on board with this because there's more meaning behind it, and it serves a purpose both for what we just talked about and also what we talked about earlier, that even in these acts of clumsiness he's helping people, right? So
Yeah.
uh but yeah, I think for the perspective that it gives him, it's I really enjoyed that moment, and kind of giving Clark his due in all of this. We've been going for over 2 hours. We've covered a lot. I know we could. I'm sure we could. There's always more to say about All Star Superman. The I'll toss. I will, give you the final word on whatever else you want to share. I will just say this, especially for anyone who maybe you never read it, or maybe you did and it didn't connect with you fully the way it didn't fully connect with me initially. I would just say take another look at it, kind of keeping in mind that it is this encapsulation of the larger mythology, and it weaves in aspects from so many different eras, and plays with a lot of the tropes. So again, at least I know that was one of the things that hindered my enjoyment initially, was the use of aspects or dynamics that weren't necessarily part of my ideal version or my preferred version. So kind of keeping in mind what the mandate of this story is, I guess, in this all-star line of really encapsulating the bigger picture. But then also, I think we cited so many instances of of the character's humanity. And again, I'm not trying to project my experience onto any. Maybe that's not something that people wrestled with, but for me, that was definitely one of those things. Seeing him more as this detached God in this story, and now after all the times I've read it and thinking about it and the conversation we had, it's like you see so much of the person he is coming through all of this. So again, my perspective has changed a lot. For anyone who hasn't read it, it's definitely worth revisiting. Previously, would I have included this in my list of top stories, like personal favorites? I don't know, probably not, but I do now. So, what else would you like to say before we sign off?
The only other thing I want to talk about is in issue 12, Lex's moment of realization. It's great, read issue 12, watch the movie, do everything else. But there's a specific scene that always stuck with me. I'm not even sure why. Once Lex realizes the full scope of Superman's abilities in the sense of what he can perceive. Again, earlier in the series, Lois talks about hearing stars and songs and seeing things. It's not just a question of how strong and durable Superman is; it's perception. Um, and Lex is a scientist. He talks throughout the entire series about how he worships science and reason and being rational and all these other things. He pushes the priest away when he's in the electric chair because he says you stink of the irrational, which is of course an overblown reaction to this idea of I am a man of science. I can measure things and look at things and whatever else. And when the moment finally hits that he has a full awareness of the super senses, his mind immediately goes to work on answering a question, which is how do the fundamental forces of the universe mesh and work together, which is something he's never been able to answer. No one's ever been able to answer. And the answer given here, Lex says with tears in his eyes as he turns to his niece, Nasty Luthor, he says it's all thought controlled, and he says it's consciousness, it's us, um, this is how he, Superman, sees all the time, every day. Um, it's all just us in here together. And then very quietly he says, and we are all we've got. And I feel like that's the most powerful line in the entire thing, because you keep saying, Superman is kind and he helps everyone no matter what. And yeah, he does do that because that's the way he was raised. But what Lex realizes is that Superman also knows for a fact, no questions asked, that that is the only thing that matters. Helping people and doing everything is the fundamental nature of the universe they live in. And I think that's an incredibly powerful thing because it allows Lex to answer that fundamental question of why does a guy with omnipotence not do what I would do? The answer is, well, you couldn't see things from his perspective, and now you can. And now, when you understand the answer to your question and see that it also answers the question of why you couldn't see things from this guy's perspective, it changes everything. And again, if you go back to the animated movie, and you think that once Lex wakes up from the beating he receives from poisoning the freaking sun, he decides to try to give this to as many people as possible and handing the book to Leo. In the scene where he hands it to Leo, he actually quotes the 8-word origin to him, meaning that in the animated universe, it's Lex who writes that down. And again, I love the idea that Lex experiences this, answers his own questions, learns something about not only his enemy, but himself, and decides to share that with everyone else. I think it's beautiful.
Beautiful and beautifully said. Thank you for your insight into the story. It was really great to have this discussion, and again to consider this right after whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow, where it's really funny because you look at both stories, and especially when you look at All Star in conjunction with 1 Million, both give us these final Superman stories that end with Superman and Lois together. We have a wink. We have a progeny. We have generations to come, right? But they unfold in different ways. But I would say that again, I think the version we get here is very fitting for this particular story, for Morrison's version of the character. He comes from the stars, he returns to the sun after showing people the face of the Man of Tomorrow. It's really I again, this is why I waited until now to do this episode, because I don't know, my perspective would have been a lot different, would have been a lot more limited, would not have been as glowing if we had done this at episode 4. So that's why we did this now, and it's been an absolute blast to have this conversation. So, Mike, thank you again for joining me for this. Audience, thank you as always. This was a long one. I mean, we're no stranger to long episodes, but we've been generally under 2 hours, I think, for the most part for a while. So, but this one deserved it. So thank you for joining us. We will be back next week. Next time I'm going to be joined by Tyler Patrick from the Krypton Report podcast, and we're going to be talking about For the Man Who Has Everything. So make sure you come back and join us for that episode in 1 week. As always, it's about what you do. It's about action. This show is part of the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network, home to Digging for Kryptonite, another exciting episode in the adventures of Superman, Summoning the Zords, and My Comic Shop History, available wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review today. Sign up at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato for additional content. Thank you all